welcome to Like a Boss with me, Lauren. Today we're talking about exam strategies because it is the end of semester very suddenly, not quite sure how that happened. And that means we are approaching one of the most stressful times in the semester calendar, and that is exam time. Now, exams this year will be run a little bit differently to normal. Some of them will be here on campus as usual with some social distancing measures, but some will be online. So it's really important that you check out the Flinders exam information page and your topic flow pages to make sure that you know where you are supposed to be and when. And I've got links to the Flinders exam page in the blog, so check that out. Another thing that I'm going to do to start out is to point you to one of my very first vlogs, which was planning to online. And this video goes through some really important information about setting up your study space, setting a daily routine with anchor points, and organizing yourself and your time. And those general rules don't really change for exam period. They just become a little bit more important and a little bit more intense. So have a look at that if you don't already know it. Otherwise, let's get straight into some evidence-based exam revision strategies. And to do that, I'm going to start by just explaining a little tiny bit about how the brain processes and remembers information, because that will help us to understand why these techniques are so effective. The first really important thing to know is that our memories are reconstructive. Our brain isn't like a library where information is simply shelved until we need it. Every time we retrieve a memory, we alter it, we refine it, and we strengthen it. And this can be both good and bad. If we misattribute information or recall the wrong information, we can actually kind of consolidate that wrong information. But if we recall information correctly, or if we correct ourselves after recalling the wrong information, then we make those memories much, much stronger. Now, for that recall to happen, which is what we need to happen during exams, that information has to go from our short-term memory at the point of learning into our long-term memory. And for this to happen, information must be encoded in a very deep and meaningful way. When we learn something new, specific groups of neurons fire in our brains as a response to that incoming information. Some of these patterns are new, and some of them represent things that we already know. New information is attached to old information through pathways and patterns. And this is why we remember things better if it's attached to some existing knowledge. In order to recall or remember information, we have to be able to reactivate those same patterns and pathways that were active at the point of learning. And when we do this, we consolidate those memories. Those patterns are strengthened, and memory becomes much easier and easier to access. Okay, so the first really important technique is spaced practice. And spaced practice is basically the opposite of cramming. When we cram, we might be able to remember and regurgitate, some of that information in the short term, but it won't last in the long term. Our brains make stronger connections and create those better long-term memories when learning events or study sessions are spaced out rather than massed in quick succession. We need to give our brains time to build those new neural pathways, particularly when we're dealing with quite complex and analytical information. Think about it. Would you feel more confident crossing a bridge that was built very quickly overnight, or would you feel more confident crossing a bridge that was built bit by bit over time? I know which one I would feel more confident with. Our brains are doing the same thing. They're building these kind of roads and bridges and pathways between bits of information, and they need time to do that properly. And while this does mean that you need to be a little bit more organized and start your revision earlier, it will save you time in the long run. Studies show that the same level of memorization can be achieved in a total shorter time if that time is spaced out. So that means you can learn and remember the same information better in 3 hours that are broken up into 3 one-hour blocks than you can in one 3-hour block or even a 4 or 5-hour block. So to make this effective, the first thing you need to do is to create a revision timetable. And when planning for your revision, try to start as early as you can. In a perfect world, this means spending an hour or two every week, going over your notes, making sure they're organized and consolidating what you've learned. But realistically, this means starting at least 3 or 4 weeks before your exam. And then set aside blocks of about 2 to 3 hours for each kind of topic or main concept that you need to learn every couple of days leading up to that exam. And make sure that when you're setting out your timetable, you leave yourself time for all of the other things you need to do in your life, your major assignments that you've got on, your family commitments, work, and rest and sleep. Rest is super, super, super important if you want your memories to be consolidated. A technique you can use as part of your space practice is called interleaving. And this is the practice of switching between topics as we study. So rather than studying just one concept in a full session, you might take two similar, but not exactly the same ideas and study them in varying order. It works best if you interleave two similar study areas so that you can make connections between ideas and problem-solving techniques. And the next last part of space practice is to plan to forget. The thing that makes spaced practice really work is that it actually gives our brains time to forget. And this does make your study feel a little bit more difficult, and it seems a little bit counterintuitive. But the harder our brains have to work to retrieve that same information in future study sessions, the more that memory is reinforced. And this is also why space practice works particularly effectively when combined with active recall techniques or retrieval practice. So let's get into that. So retrieval practice is basically the opposite of passive review, or when we simply read over our lecture notes or re-watch a recorded lecture and expect that we'll be able to remember everything in an exam. Spoiler alert, guys, that doesn't work very well. Active recall is really all about bringing information from our memories into the front of our minds, and it's best when we generate this information for ourselves. Basically, it's the difference between active and passive learning. Active recall is the most effective method for creating long-term memory. There are quite a few different techniques that we can employ to make sure that we incorporate active recall into our revision. First one is practice tests. So start with a practice test before you start doing the rest of your revision. This will assess your ability to retrieve information, and it will show you what gaps you have in your understanding and therefore where you need to put a little bit more of your time and effort. You're also more likely to remember information if you got it wrong, especially if you were confident about that answer. And this is called the hypercorrection effect. It basically, our brains don't want to be embarrassed and they get a little bit surprised when we get things wrong. And so we work harder to retain the correct information. To do this well, make sure you test yourself early and test yourself often. I would also suggest making your own quiz out of your notes or your textbooks. Creating questions forces you to input and process that information so that you can output it in your own words, and this really helps you understand it more deeply. Another effective way to test your active recall is to use flashcards. Making them yourself is also much more effective than using pre-made ones because, again, it forces you to intake and output information in your own words or in diagrams. So write a question on one side of your flashcard and write the answer on the other. Try adding images to the words to help you create stronger associations. This is called dual coding, which I'll talk more about in a moment. Break complex concepts into multiple questions. This helps you to avoid the illusion of confidence, which is when you remember part of an answer but not the whole thing, so you still think you got it right. Also, say your questions out loud when you answer them, so actually verbalize it. This works especially well if you're studying with a partner. And make sure that you study your flashcards in both directions. Don't treat them as a question and answer. This will help you make sure that you understand the relationship between those two bits of information, and it will prepare you for a question that is written in either direction in your exam. Another one, make yourself a cheat sheet even if you're not allowed to take one into the exam. Cheat sheets are a really effective way of processing information because they force you to summarize and reduce that information into its most essential parts. They also really force you to think about what you actually think will be included in the exam. They can be used for practice tests during your revision. And just like creating flashcards and creating your own questions, they force you to input and output information, which makes you process it at a deeper level. My next big strategy is to study as though you are going to teach the material, not be tested on it. Teaching forces you to summarize and paraphrase complex topics, which means that you're engaging in that information in a way that synthesizes and consolidates it. This basically makes use of a technique called elaboration, which is the process of strengthening your understanding of something by adding information to it. It involves describing, connecting, and organizing your ideas and thinking about things on a deeper level. And you can do this on your own, or I really recommend, if you can, getting together with a study group. And there are a few techniques that you can add into your revision to study as though you're going to teach. Firstly, try interrogation. Interrogation involves asking questions about how and why things work and then producing answers to those questions. So try explaining out loud the steps that you are taking to solve a problem, or describe connections between two concepts, ask questions about the process, the mechanics, or the theory behind an idea, or in a study group, split up key concepts amongst your group to learn and then teach them to each other. Another way that you can do this is to use dual coding. So dual coding is combining visual and verbal information together. We process verbal and visual information in different ways through separate channels. So dual coding gives us two pathways instead of one to help us remember that information later on. And it also creates those shortcuts that I was talking about before. Think about how a lecturer might put together their slides, combining verbal and visual information, and do the same thing for yourself. So go through your textbooks and lecture slides and find visuals that are used alongside words, and ask yourself and your study group how the visuals represent what is described in the text. Or create diagrams, images, or maps to describe processes that are otherwise only in verbal form, and explain them to yourself or your study group. Or describe pictures or images in your own words, either writing them down or just saying them out loud. And now for a technique for helping to actually prepare you for exam day. And I want to tell you about something called context recall techniques. So context-dependent memory is the phenomenon whereby we recall information better when it is retrieved in the same context where it was learned. So basically, our brains make associations between what we're learning and the conditions in which we learn it. This context might be physical, like the room that you're in when you learn it, or it might be emotional or psychological. This all has to do with the way that our brains encode information and create associations between images, words, and ideas. And this means maybe trying to create similar conditions between where you revise and where you're going to take that exam. The more similar these things are, the more associations your brain is going to make, and it's going to help make it easier for you to retrieve that same information. So this might mean maybe studying with your pens and paper laid out the same way that you might do that in an exam room, or studying with a cheat sheet beside you or some scribble paper. Or it might mean timing yourself while you take a practice test. Researchers also suggest trying to visualize the space that you have been studying in when you first enter the exam room. So this involves creating a mental image from some of the environmental cues that were around you when you were revising, so such as items in the room or its spatial layout. So say you first learned a new concept during a lecture. So visualize yourself watching that lecture. Where were you? Were you physically in the lecture room? Probably not. Were you watching it online? What did the lecturer look like? Where were you sitting at your desk? All of these things can help your brain trick itself into making a few shortcuts to that same information. So my last couple of things have to do with exam day strategies. So firstly, remember your equipment. What are you allowed? Do you need special pencils? Do you need a calculator or a dictionary? Is it open book and you need to take your notes or certain textbooks with you? Do you need to bring a clear plastic bag to bring them in? And don't forget your student ID. Use your reading time effectively. Spend this time going through your exam and noting the number of questions, and estimate how long you think each might take you. If you think of anything super important, do a little brain dump on your scrap paper before you forget it. Now make sure you read the questions properly. Really slow down. It's super easy to rush and miss really important wording and phrasing in our questions. You might even try underlining key concept words and task words. If you have a multiple choice exam, try guessing the answer in your head before you look at the answers. This will help you make you feel more confident in your response. If you have a long answer or an essay answer question, try sketching out your argument in dot points on your scrap paper before you begin writing, and spend more time on your introduction and your topic sentences so that your marker gets a very clear idea of where your argument is going. If you have an open book exam, download the chapters that you need before the exam. Some ebooks have limited access, and you do not want to be in the middle of an exam and find that you cannot access the chapter that you need. The library have some guides about how to do that, and those are linked in the blog. And lastly, keep calm. Take a breath, take a sip of water. If you're feeling really stuck, move on to the next question. I know this was a long one, guys, but I hope it was helpful. Next week, I'm going to be back with Dr. Gareth, and he's going to go through some strategies for helping us tame our brain in this end of semester madness. So some tips for keeping you sane during exam and major assessment time. Make sure you check out the resources in the links in the blog. The Student Learning Support Service are also working on a lot of I'm working on a lot of exam resources, so please check those out. Good luck, and I will see you next time.